All right, in this lesson here, what we're going to be doing is going through some of the final properties that you may find of interest while working with terrain.
Okay, for starters, I'm going to go ahead and close out the terrain editing dialog because we're going to go and grab just the properties of the terrain info actor itself. Now, I might still have it selected, and no, I don't, so let me go and hunt around a little bit, or be even quicker, double-click terrain info, and just search for it that way. So there we've got the terrain info, conveniently kind of hidden underneath the terrain. But terrain info, you saw we had various editing control inside the terrain editing dialog, but this is still an actor, and as you saw in the last lesson, we edited a few properties for the deco layer under the terrain info properties. Let me move the view into a little bit better of an angle here. Alright, let's go over just a few of these that might be useful when further editing or optimizing terrain. So first off, BK collision half res. If your mesh is very detailed and it's very critical that it reacts smoothly with Karma, you can activate this and there won't be as much geometry data, actually fewer triangles being fed to Karma, which can improve speed for dynamic situations or simulations. After that, you have decal layer offset. What decal layer offset does is, say you had a static mesh where its pivot point wasn't on the ground. Of course, these are. But if you say you had a custom static mesh or one that didn't line up perfectly with the ground, you can raise or lower this off the ground by adjusting the decal layer offset. If I set it to 100, you notice all the decal layer jumps off the surface itself, off the terrain, and negative if necessary, set it below the terrain. In our case, 0 works fine. Just if you had a static mesh, you realize that it was above or below the terrain, you can very quickly edit that with the decal layer offset. Keep in mind that this affects all decal layers. And zero that back out. And under that, we'll hit decal layers in just a second. I want to finish off the main terrain info properties. Inverted, true or false. If we set that to true, and we move underneath, you notice that the terrain is basically upside down. Now, this is a very interesting method of making something like, say, the roof of a cave. Hint, hint. So let me go back and just, if you wanted to invert the terrain so it's visible from above, if you're using it anywhere above the player, that would be very useful. Set it to false and go back to the normal type terrain we can reside on top of. We'll get into layers in just a second. Now, terrain map. Say you wanted to completely swap out the map for something else. Say you would come up with a grayscale in Photoshop or your favorite paint program and brought it in. You could actually change the terrain map from here. You could simply import a texture into the texture browser and set it. One thing to keep in mind, though, I'll point this out in the terrain editing dialog. If you were to bring in an 8-bit grayscale, it would show as format P8. To get the full detail terrain is capable of, you would want to convert it to the internal 16-bit format, and you can do that by simply right-clicking on it. I won't get the menu now because this is already a 16-bit texture. But again, if it was an 8-bit texture and you needed the extra bit depth, simply right-click here, and you'd be able to change it over to 16-bit. That is if you had brought it in and assigned a terrain map through this setting. After that, we've got terrain scale. Now, this would work very well if you had, well, this is just the overall scale of the terrain itself. If you wanted more detail, you could bring in a large texture, which would initially make the terrain very large, but then you could set the X and Y scale less, and you can see it would bring the terrain in a lot tighter. Of course, this would be more triangles in a tighter area, which could slow down the game, especially in Karma situations. So that's not necessarily a good thing to do. You might want to just leave that based off its default density and adjust using the overall map size. Now with the Z scale, this is a little bit more interesting. It's not the overall resolution. It's the high, or not the how tightly packed the triangles are. It's how high the map is. Say, and notice real quick. Let me wander over here to the texture browser again, and if I go hunt down, take a look at the terrain map. Even though we've made some noticeable detail in 3D, you can easily see the different edits and the hills we've created from pulling and pushing the terrain or painting on it. This is the resulting grayscale. It's barely noticeable in some places that we've made any editing to it at all. Now, say for example, you had just brought in a texture from Photoshop where you'd use the full bit depth from white to black. That would be in a very, very high change in Z. So you'd have hills that were too high and then the values were too narrow. The map wouldn't be anywhere near playable. and you didn't want to go back and readjust your grayscale level, you could simply adjust the Z scale. If I was to bring that down by half, notice how I just dropped this level. So if you had a texture that was varying too much in Z, you can simply scale that back with terrain scale. Enough blabbing about 3 numbers. On to vertex light map. If you have a custom light map, basically any texture you want, you can set that here. As a matter of fact, my trippy little color map might work. Yeah, yuck, but you get the point. If you wanted to basically paint light onto the terrain as opposed to baking it on through rebuilding, this would give you the means to do so. Let me clear that back off, and I might have to rebuild to fix that up, like such. So we'll go back, and it looks like I might have caught the texture on that decal layer, but we'll be looking at its properties soon enough anyway. And bring up, let's see, hunt down the terrain info one last time, and continuing on. So that's vertex light map. Now back up to the whole decal layer section. This contains a lot of useful stuff when editing. This gives an extra level of control. Let me go in and see if I can clear off that extra colors. Yeah, the color got applied to, let me go to the grass level. Color map, if I clear that out, force clear it. Okay, back to where we were. Now, some interesting properties for decal layers. First, we have align to terrain. I think this might be a little bit more visible in the first one. So let me go over to align to terrain, 1 or 0. Setting this to 1 will cause the decoration to go straight out from the normal of whatever quad it's sitting on, or whatever face. So you can see as the train started to move upward, these start to shoot off the side. It can be kind of interesting if you have more mechanical stuff, but organic objects like plants usually grow upwards, so it's best to leave that off for like grass and stuff. If you had just junk, like pieces of like metallic junk just laying around, you might want to try turning that on to test the effect. Color map, you saw this is where we can take a color where we had the stripes, or as a matter of fact, where we have the varying color for the first brush type map. If you wanted to go in there and change it real quick, you could come in and do so. Density map, this is where we first assign that back in the texture editing dialog. If you wanted to swap out the density map for another alpha or grayscale, go ahead and do that here. Density multiplier. Now this is a little bit interesting. Notice how even when we painted on a pretty solid amount, or a fairly solid amount into the grayscale, we still have a like only so dense that we can get before it just randomizes instead of adding more. Inside the density multiplier, we can increase that. If we up this all the way to 0.5, notice we now have a lot more. Now there is one more limit I'll be pointing out in just a second, but you can see we can adjust various just the density, the minimum and maximum density for this area. So take out some so we have like tighter clumps, and then more wide space, or bring them closer together, or even drop this back down so it's not so noticeable. So that's density multiplier. And disregard terrain lighting. What this will do, let me see if I can find a place where I've baked a there's a shadow near one of these meshes. I might have to paint a few over the shadow to really get that effect. Basically what it is the light value. Yeah, this grass should work. Let me go and grab the grass layer. Alright, now we have disregard lighting. If we turn this on, it no longer respects the light value of the quad it's sitting on, whereas before this area, this terrain was darker, and the static mesh itself was picking that up and being equally dark. If you turn disregard terrain lighting on, then it'll go back to being full bright unless we use lit directional, which I'll talk about in just a second. Let me turn that back off so we grab the actual color of what it's residing on. Now draw order. This might be a little bit tricky to see without some of the other meshes in view. I don't know if you can see in the distance. Basically, what it's doing now without sorting is it's not really deciding for sure whether or not one static mesh is in front of another. It's actually drawing the ones in the distance with the same priority as the ones in the foreground. It's hard to show, and it will probably be even harder to see once this is resized, the video is resized to its final size. But basically, if you're having a problem where you're looking through a static mesh or a decoration, but a decoration in the background is drawn over it, then you need to change the draw order. I usually find that draw back to front works pretty well. You might have been able to notice that I actually cut a little bit of the darker ones out because they were behind these. So that is, my bearings again, the simple draw order. Now, fade out radius. You already saw that a little bit when I had to enable this or add a bit of a radius so we could see anything at all. If I was to take these way back down, say about 10, notice how they start to fade out. Let me set this to about 30. Just give a very tight radius. And notice how as I move the view really close, alright, I'll have to up that some more. 100, 200. So as I get closer, you can see, now this is a very pronounced effect because I've got the radius set so low, but as I get closer, the mesh fades in, and as I get pulled away from it, it fades back. And of course, you'd make that a lot larger for actual gameplay, but that's just the principle of making it so that the decorations way off in the distance won't draw and won't eat up processing time. Let me up that so it's a little bit more visible in the distance. So that's fade out radius. Now, lit directional. What lit directional will do is actually add some shading. You notice even if a decoration was picking up the shadowing from the terrain, it was still a uniform shading for the entire static mesh. If you turn decoration, if you turn lit directional to 1, they're now based off the direction of the light. Now, this sometimes can act a little funny, as you can see here, but generally what this is for, maybe if I turn off disregard lighting. But generally what this is for is it in most cases will give a fading effect where the side of the decoration closer to the sunlight will be brighter and then it will fade to darker. Let me turn this back to 0, lit directional back to 1. Generally, as long as you have smooth shadows, it usually looks best with lit directional off. But again, just something to play with depending on your map's lighting. Now, max per quad. Now, you notice we have the ability to up the density multiplier, but you can only get that effect so high with only one mesh per quad. But using max per quad, you can allow more. That's more per face on the terrain. So in this case, in some of the tighter areas, multiple static meshes were being assigned as decorations to every single quad. And of course, you could really bog down gameplay by turning that way up. It's kind of fun just for playing around with to add a nice field of grass. Random yaw. What that will do is, let me actually real quick just grab a different static mesh to point this one out. Under static meshes, let me grab lamppost and assign that instead of the grass. Other than being kind of interesting to be able to paint lampposts, notice how they're all oriented the same way. If you're trying to distribute some uniform mesh but make it look a little bit more random on the mesh, you can use random yaw. By activating that, you'll notice that they now have a random rotation. So very simple, but a very nice way of scattering a more technical looking mesh. Turn that back off. And scale map. You saw before when we had the different colored grass that we actually use that color to specify the scale. This would be simply if you wanted to assign a different scale map through the properties. Now, scale multiplier. This is kind of interesting. If, say, for example, you didn't want to go back and retweak your original colors, or you simply wanted more of an effect on a certain axis, you can load up the scale multiplier and set a minimum and maximum scale. 1 and 1 means that all the meshes will be uniform. That is based off of what scale map. Now, you don't even need a scale map to use this, but it would still be in effect if you had. Since we're not using a scale map on the light posts, we can basically assign it using the min and max. If we were to take the min down to like 0.5, some of the meshes are now half size. Notice we have a little bit of fading because I turned on the fade out radius or lowered the min radius. But now we have varying heights, and the maximum we could set that above 1, maybe even 2, so they're a lot taller. So they can go anywhere from 0.5 to twice as high as normal. So you can adjust the multiplier, and again, in all 3 axes. So you can close that up. Seed, what this is you'll notice that static meshes get placed randomly. Even if you paint a density map, it's still random placement based on the max density between density multiplier and max per quad. And if you don't like how the random placement ended up, you can always just change the seed. This is basically just the initial randomization number, if you will. So as we change that, we just get totally different randomizations of placement. So if you need to do some tweaking or just don't like the way the meshes ended up, you can always just play around with different seeds. Show on invisible terrain. Let me go and actually, I would need to paint a little bit more. Basically what this means is there's still terrain in this area where we cut through, and if show on invisible terrain was turned on, it would actually show on parts that we had painted out with the visibility tool. Show on terrain is simply whether or not this decal layer shows at all. If we turn show on terrain to 0, we don't see the decal layer. If we turn it back on, it reappears. It's nice for when testing the map if you simply want to take the decal layer out temporarily to tweak other things. And finally, static mesh. As you saw just a second ago, I could assign different static meshes at will, and that's also available within texture editing, so whichever is closer. If you're messing around in the properties, you can just grab the static mesh from here. And that should pretty much cover most of what you'd want to go through inside of decal layers. Finally, we have layers themselves. And inside the layers we're currently using, we have stuff like the alpha map. Again, if you have a custom alpha map you want to use. And then you have the layer rotation. That's a good point. I guess I need to go ahead real quick before we wrap this up and show the different rotation ability inside the editing dialog. And real quick, just throwing this in, say we wanted to grab the overall texture that belonged to a certain layer. Remember in the first lesson, or the second lesson, we didn't go through the texture, pan, rotate, and scale? That's because they apply to layers. Now that we have some layers, let me go ahead and grab one of them. And with that layer selected, if I grab texture pan and control left or right drag, you can see I can pan the texture over the surface. So if you simply have different points where you want the texture to align, you can grab pan and pan it up until it matches up. Texture rotate will grab the entire texture and actually rotate a little bit. So if you want to add an angle, like a 45-degree angle, just drag it until it looks about like that. And finally, texture scale. If you initially didn't have the U-pan and V-pan set up the way you want, you can grab texture scale and scale the texture out in U or V, and actually add a stretched look or pull it back in, or however you need to adjust the texture. So that's probably the easiest method of editing textures, because it's visual. You can drag it around in the viewport. But again, if you need to, you can always go and grab Train Info for one last time. Underneath layers, this is where those layers actually play into effect. You can go in. Well, actually, it's probably more of it's a separate offset. If we add like 2000, of course I'm editing this one over here, but just an extra layer of control for the layer's rotation, the texture that it's currently using, and texture map axis. If you had, let me see if I can find one against the wall here. Basically, it'll project, like right now, it's projecting on the XY, so basically projecting from straight down onto it. If most of your terrain was at an angle, you could try projecting from a different axis, like for example, projecting onto the side of a mountain. Generally, though, you'll use XY because most of the textures lay out flat across the terrain. After that, we have some more rotation and the initial U scale and V scale. If you had better numbers in mind and didn't want to play around with the scaling inside the editing dialog, got a few numbers down here. So with that should pretty much cover the properties. It's kind of tedious, but it's nice to know what some of these do, because there's a whole lot of tweaking that can be done at the properties level.
Very cool.
So with that should pretty much wrap it up, and that should most definitely get you started on how to work with and then go back and edit and add to terrain.
Absolutely. Fantastic job, Logan. Fantastic. All right, well, that's going to conclude this lesson on terrain. Thanks a lot, everyone. Take care.